In 1929, when the stock market crashed, very few people had the vision to realize that the prosperity of the 20s were over and the ordeal of depression was just over the horizon. In the early 1930s, at the height of the Great Depression, there were 16 million people unemployed, with an additional 25 million people dependent on them for their survival. 60 years later, it is hard to believe that millions of Americans went hungry, thousands of schools had closed, and an estimated 1,000 homes a day were foreclosed to mortgage holders. In the cities, the new poor lived in public parks or Hoovervilles or sold apples on the streets to avoid public begging. In rural areas, a farmer's crops were hardly worth harvesting because of depressed prices. In some areas of the South, sharecroppers and tenant farmers were reduced to eating dandelion soup to stay alive. The images of the Depression are etched in our collective memory by the pictures taken in that era, which put a face to the economic terror that blighted so many lives in that time. Not everyone suffered equally. Many people who lived through the Depression will tell you that they didn't have any money, but they didn't go hungry because they lived on a family farm, and they felt people in the cities had it worse. By 1933, the city, county, and state governments, which had always taken care of the people during hard times, had exhausted their resources. The sheer magnitude of the crisis finally galvanized the federal government into action, which to an older generation of Americans soon became known simply as the New Deal. On the eve of the New Deal, the late Jess Bohannon of Cartersville recalled hard times when he stated prices were low, but there wasn't any money to buy anything. Jess was supporting a family of 10 on about $5 a week. Another voice described Cartersville in those days.
Cartersville was an old town, but it was a tired old town. In rainy weather, some of the streets turned to red slop, and grass grew on some of the sidewalks. It was a time when folks would say, "We're too poor to paint and too proud to whitewash." Somehow it was hotter then. A black dog suffered on a summer's day. Bony mules hitched to Hoover carts flicked flies in the sweltering shade of the live oaks on the square. Men's stiff collars wilted by 9 in the morning. Ladies bathed before noon, after their 3 o'clock naps, and by nightfall were like soft tea cakes with frostings of sweat and sweet talcum. People moved slowly then. They ambled across the park, shuffled in and out of the stores around it, took their time about everything. A day was 24 hours long, but seemed longer. There was no hurry, for there was nowhere to go, nothing to buy, and no money to buy it with. Nothing to see outside the boundaries of Bartow County. But it was a time of vague optimism for some of the people. Bartow County had recently been told that it had nothing to fear but fear itself. In March 1933, Franklin Roosevelt took the oath of office and called a special session of Congress to deal with the crisis. This session was known as the famous 100 Days, when Congress passed more legislation than had been passed in the previous 100 years. 2 of the bills passed by Congress affected Cartersville and Bartow County. The Civilian Conservation Corps and the Works Progress Administration were popular programs that put people back to work and restored human dignity. The idea of the CCC was FDR's, conceived in the dark winter of 1933 as a means to provide useful employment for the many young men caught in the Depression, unable to find work and faced with the possibility of the street corner, the hobo camp, or riding the rails as a tramp. Joe Myers and Woodrow Bradley recall those days.
Yeah, it was designed for young men 17 through 28 that were idle at that time, and the 8 million young men that just couldn't find work no way at all. And a lot of the young men, and some had gone to high school, some had gone to college, and some had never gone to school at all. They come from the hills and the farms and so forth. And so they couldn't find work. There just was no work for them. And so the CCC that was enacted in March of 1933 took them off the streets, and it kept a lot of young men from falling through the cracks.
How did they get this program operational so quick?
Because of the Army, they turned it over to the United States Army, and they administered it, and they sent instructors from the Army, and they got it into operation in just a very short time. Got men into the national forests and that were under the Department of Interior, and then the soil conservation that followed it was under the Department of Agriculture.
I see. Now, if the Army administered it, but the young men were not in the military as such, in other words, they took their orders from officers. Like if you had a CCC camp, the supervisors would be lieutenants and captains and that sort of thing.
In the administration end of it, you had lieutenants and captains that was in charge of the company, and then you had forestry men and soil conservation men that was over the operation that done the duty, and we had forest rangers in the national parks and so forth and so on, and the young men did the labor. But the Army supervised the administration, and then your cooks and your mess sergeants and your supply sergeants and everything like that, they were directly in control of the camp itself.
I see.
And administration. And then the young men worked out under leaders and special people that were enrolled to help supervise the jobs and do the jobs, to build the roads and the monuments and the parks and all that kind of stuff, and to fight fires and reforestation in certain places.
In July 1933, the CCC was the first relief agency to go into action. Thousands of young men from coast to coast lined up in front of Army induction centers to file their applications and pass a physical. Then they were sent to military posts and into various states where the camps were set up, often by their own hands. One aging enrollee of the CCC recalled recently, "I was sent to Utah. I'll never forget the ride up the mountains in this battered old truck. We had an old grizzled Army sergeant in charge. When we got to the area, it was just thick woods. 'Where's the camp?' I asked. The Sarge waved his hands around the trees. 'This is it. Break out the axes and chop like hell if you don't want to sleep on the ground.' We chopped and built cabins and even a mess hall. For the next 3 years, I grew up physically, mentally, and spiritually in that beautiful country. It was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. Before I left, I was offered a job as a ranger. To this day, I wonder whether I was a fool in turning it down and coming back east." The CCC became the most popular of all the New Deal agencies. Jobless youths working in the outdoors, teenagers building roads in the unpenetrated sections of the far west. The prospect of this caught the public imagination. It also impressed businessmen. They later showed a preference for hiring a man who had been in the CCC, and the reasoning was simple. Employers felt that anyone who had been in the CCC would know what a full day's work meant and how to carry out orders in a disciplined way. Their experience gave them manual know-how and self-confidence. In the beginning, Rangers and Army personnel found the majority of the enrollees with no previous work experience were undernourished, badly clothed, bitter, resentful, hostile. Within a month, the plain but wholesome food, the outdoors, the comradeship, the regular hours, the work, and the feeling that they were useful and helping their families restored the enrollees to the high morale, which has always characterized American youth. Well, let's talk about the CCC camp here in Bartow County. I understand there were really two, and if you or Joe would elaborate on the two camps. That had one, and then it was moved to Cartersville, as I understand it.
Well, in 1935, I was with the CCC in the Nantahala National Forest at Etowah, and I was mess sergeant, and we got orders from Fort Mac to train a cadre to come to Cartersville, Georgia, to open a soil conservation camp in Cartersville, Georgia. Well, I began training some cooks and a baker and a mess sergeant at that time up there. And then the mess sergeant that I trained, I decided I wanted to come, and I left him there, and I come down here to open this mess and come with the cadre down here. And so we arrived here on June the 25th, 1935. We arrived at the courthouse in Cartersville, and we met Captain Joe Clark, and Tom Shippey was lieutenant. We went up to Clear Lake and a little pine thicket up there, and we started clearing out. I never saw so many chiggers in my life as we got on us up there. We cleaned out that pine thicket up there to set up that camp. We put up tents, and in a few days we began to get in the portable barracks that had to be put together. And we began putting those portable barracks together. And of course we put up 4 barracks up there that housed 50 men to the barrack, and then we put up a recreational building, and we put up the other buildings that went for the soil conservation men, quarters for them and quarters for the officers and so forth and so on. So in a few months, we had it pretty well ship shape, and we began to get in the men. And we worked just night and day to begin with up there till we got the camp set up. And by the end of the summer, by the time Paul got there, we were ready for the men to come in and to begin their court. But we still had no water. We had been drilling up there from the time we got there and drilled all the rest of that year up until Christmas, and we never did get any water. Huh. And then the Army decided to disband that camp. And so I left here at that time, and so I don't know anything about the new camp that that's up where the American Legion is now. But there's 2 other camps come to Marteau County, one at the American Legion up there, and one on up close to Pine Log up in that area. There was another one up in there, but I never saw those 2.
So one at Cartersville came into being long in the summer of 1935. And I came to Cartersville about that time, as soon as it was established. I was originally at the camp at Clear Lake that Mr. Bradley was talking about. And I would like to say that camp did, even though it didn't stay there very long, it did do some very good, outstanding work. I guess you might be familiar with the CCC road up in that country that goes from Clear Lake over to Hall Station. That camp built that road for a fire trail, truck trail. There was a lot of fires. Everybody in this country believed in fires at that time, and there's a vast acres of woodland back in there. And this truck trail was built to get for access to that area. Another very important job that it did was it built a foundation and made repairs on the Confederate monument at Cassville. A very important thing. And that was about the extent of the project. Did a little farm work, but that was a bad winter, fall, and winter, and so it wasn't possible to do too much work.
There were 300 major types of labor performed by the enrollees in the CCC, scattered all over the country on thousands of different projects. They worked in the national forest and in state forests and in state parks. They enlarged the national forest trail systems, provided new camping grounds, improved park structures, built high bridges, and countless miles of stone walls from New York State to the old Illinois Central Canal Country. In the Jamestown area, where the first English settlers had arrived, the Corps helped archaeologists in restoration work. CCC camps sprang up in the Skokie Lagoon section of Illinois, out through the Black Hills of Dakota, down into Texas, and in the forests of Georgia. In terms of the scope of the CCC, I guess it would depend upon where you were. If you're in a national forest, you planted trees and thinned out trees and
built roads.
And if you were in an area like this, you also worked on private farms, didn't you, with soil conservation?
Oh yes, that was principally what we did, local farmer.
Now, how would that work? For example, if I was a farmer and if I had cotton gullies on my farm and that sort of thing, would I get in touch with you? And in other words, how's the government going to come out and work on my private farm, I guess?
Well, it wasn't quite that simple. There was a Bartow County with, at that time, with 5 other counties, I believe 6 counties, was in an organization known as the Soil Conservation District, which was a farmer government operation. And each county had a Soil Conservation Service technician who worked with landowners who requested it and made a plan, a conservation plan, detailed plan for that particular farm. In that plan, if there was going to be 20 acres of woodland, say, planted, the plan specified that the farmer would provide so many thousand seedlings and so many hours labor, and that the government, which was the CCC, would provide so many hours of labor and so many thousands of trees. And that's how it tied in. There was several different organizations connected with the CCC. Actually, it itself was just one, the main, of course, a group involved there.
In other words, like the State Forestry Service might have a project, they'd use CCC labor, and the Soil Conservation, another agency could use them. And is that kind of a cooperative project?
Yes, quite a bit of that was done. You have seen the pictures of Fire Trail, the CCC road was one of them. There was an agreement between the Forest Service and the Soil Conservation Service to do those jobs under that same payback system. In fact, the business, we built those 2 fire lookout towers and 2 roads up Pine Log Mountain and Signal Mountain in this county, and for a camp that was in Chattahoochee Forest, up in the upper part of the Walker County, in that area. And they would pay back the labor on there. Again, they had that technicians in there who had to plan. Those counties were all in the district, and they would pay back that labor on doing farm work.
How was the CCC camp perceived by the community here? Was it welcomed as a welcome addition to Cartersville? And how did the young men get along in the community and that sort of thing?
Well, at first they didn't want it in Cartersville. In fact, there was an injunction against it coming in.
Is that right?
But when it did get in and get established and began operating, it began spreading money. The food, the basic food came from Fort Mac, but all milk, meats, vegetables were bought locally, and that distributed a lot of money. So then it was accepted, you know, and of course they had a little problem with some boys once in a while. They were right there in Carsville, and so they were in town, and what boys would be boys.
Well, let's talk about the routine of the camp here for a moment. Let's talk about what an average day would be like from, you know, what time they wake up, and let's just go from there and finish up the whole day.
Well, let's get some notes. I think that was, well, I think I can, of course I woke up early in the morning. There was always a lot of work to be done around camp, policing and taking care of everything and in general. And this may not be the order that this happened, but anyway, they would do the exercises. They would raise the flag. They would get breakfast. They would then get ready to go to the field.
So they'd wake up, what, about 5:30 in the morning?
About 5:30,
And then
early.
Calisthenics and breakfast and so on.
Calisthenics and breakfast and police the camp. And it had to be really in good shape.
Just like the Army, huh?
Just like the Army.
I see.
Right. And so then they would go to the field and work. And when they came in, they went through some of the same routine. Of course, they had to have time to get their work done, get the baths, and get all of the things they had to do to get ready for their supper. And we still had supper. And then, after that, training started. And they went to school, those who wanted. It was compulsory that those fellows who could not read and write, hadn't been to school, it was compulsory that they go to school.
Now, who were the teachers?
Teachers, the Army furnished had an educational advisor. And a particular man in Carsville was named Barracks. I don't remember his first name. And then they hired a local lady for those lower classes. Then the Soil Conservation Service and Mr. Barone taught classes of different woodworking, furniture repairing, upholstering, and just about anything that they might want or ask for would be provided for. And they, of course, had an athletic program. And the athletic director was a man named Martin. I don't remember his first name. He was an insurance man. And he directed the athletic part.
From there, Woodrow, what would happen in your case?
Well, Reveille was at 5:30, and we ate at 6. And they, at 7 o'clock, with formation, ready to go out to the job. They usually tried to get to the job, and of course, when I was with the Forestry Service up in North Carolina, well, we had some places it was a long ways to go, but we'd get to the job by 8 o'clock and get to work, but we'd leave camp by 7 o'clock. Those of us going out to the rock crushers and to build the roads and so forth, and wherever they had to go. They had to leave camp by 7 o'clock, formation at 7 o'clock for them to get on the trucks to be hauled out. And of course then I was with the administration and with the, as mess sergeant of the company that I was with, and it was up for the cooks to prepare the meals that would be sent out in big Marmite cans to those that were out on the roads to eat and so forth. They ate out in the field. They didn't come back to eat their lunch. It was sent out to them. But they ate their breakfast in camp, and then they ate their supper in camp when they returned. They'd return to camp, they'd get back around 5 o'clock. And then by the time they got their bath, and then cleaned up, feed at 6. And then reveille, our retreat, not retreat, but bedtime was 9 o'clock. That when it sound the taps, and at 9 o'clock when the lights was out and all that, so forth and so on. But it would run exactly the same way as an army camp. And,
Well, let me mention this. The name of the program is Civilian Conservation Corps, administered by the Army and run like the Army. But if you were a young man, you could say, this works too hard, or I don't think I want to do this. You could, unlike the Army, you could just walk away from it.
You could walk away from it.
Each enrollee was to receive $30 a month pay, of which $25 was to be sent to his family. This was necessary because none of the federal relief agencies was in an operation, and state, county, and city relief had broken down because of lack of funds. Preference was given to applicants from families on relief, but other young men were permitted to enroll. If the boy's family was not on relief, then the money was deposited in an account for him until the time when he completed his enlistment.
The ones that were, when they first come into the service, they were paid $30 a month. $22 of it was sent home, and then the rest of it they got. But they were paid $30 a month. And then, of course, those leaders and so forth, why, they went up until they could make as much as $45 a month and so forth, depending on their jobs.
Well, I can't imagine young men working for $1 a day. Of course, the times were different then, we all know that. What I can't understand is, didn't they resent having to send $22 out of 30 home to their parents?
No, because their parents, it was a time in America here when we were in deep trouble all over the country, and the young men were glad to be sending that $22 home to help out at home.
And I guess all their needs were taken care of anyway, so $8 was ample.
Toothpaste and all that kind of stuff they had to buy, and if they smoked cigarettes and so forth, but all of their other things was given to them. And of course they could buy cigarettes at the canteen and so forth and so on, and everything was cheaper at the canteen. So with their $8, they could get along pretty well.
You know, there's a lot of people here in Cartersville and Bartow County is not aware that everything we're talking about is new to them in terms of there having been a CCC camp here. And if you go to the American Legion property today here in Cartersville, talk to us a minute about the scope of this operation and the kind of buildings that were there and facilities and that sort of thing.
Well, this camp was on about, I guess, probably 6 or 8 acres up there where the American Legion is now. It was bounded on the north by, it was Moon Street at that time, and on the west by Roosevelt Street, and I guess you've heard of the Big Ditch on the south. And it went extended on over and took in there, which wasn't used, where that shopping center is. There were the CCC had 18 buildings there. The beginning coming on a contour around the foot of the hill, beginning where along pretty close to the Big Ditch where there now is a metal building, was the recreation educational building. And next to it was the dining room, mess hall, and kitchen. Coming on around the circle, there was a officers' Army's supply house, then the Army office, then the Army barracks, then the Soil Conservation Service barracks, then the Soil Conservation Service office, and the Soil Conservation Service automobile repair shop building, then the blacksmith building, and some lesser buildings. On top of the hill or just below the top of the hill in the circle were the 4 barracks, where the enrollees lived.
How many would you have for each barracks? How many would
50. See, the company was 200.
Oh, okay.
And I believe that they had one of those buildings that had an additional footage on it where sometimes they would travel, like Mr. Bradley brought a cadre from North Carolina. There might be a cadre coming through, and they'd stop. Oh, so those were huge buildings.
Huh.
There was probably, when the company was at full strength, they was probably with the Army and Soil Conservation Service, probably 230 or more people in camp.
That's a big operation.
It was a big operation. It's hard to imagine passing there now.
Now, what happened to these buildings? With all these buildings, you know, they've just disappeared. What's the story on that?
I have no idea what happened to those buildings. Of course, they were portable, and I don't know if they were sold, burned, whatever happened to them.
Oh.
They went back to Fort Mac, the buildings, and what the Army did with them, I don't know, but they had to be took down. They were put up, they were bolted together when they were put up.
Oh, okay.
And then when they were took down, well, they hauled back to where they came from, whether it was Louisiana or Fort Mac or some other place.
In 4 years alone, the CCC enrollees planted 1,500,000,000 trees. If that many trees were planted 10 feet apart in a line, they would form a shelter belt 3 times around the circumference of the earth. In 2 years, 3.5 million check dams were built to control erosion, not to mention the thousands of bird sanctuaries that were set up, many still in existence, and the thousands of streams that were stocked. Any other comments you want to make about the Cartersville camp or Bartow County, whichever?
Well, on interesting sidelight, humorous maybe, as we mentioned earlier about the fire. A lot of fires back in those days, and CCC boys had to fight fires. And of course, the Cartersville camp was close to town, and there was girls in town, and there's boys in town, and they came into a little conflict there. So on the weekend, you'd see a fire get started somewhere, and take a group out and just about get it out, you'd see another fire start on another ridge. And they just had to stay out all Saturday night and all Sunday night so the local boys could have their local girls, you know. It was a lot of it was fun. A lot of serious stuff went on, but it was fun.
Well, you know, one thing I don't think we established, when these fellows got off work and came back to, so you've been out planting trees, and by the way, I understand you all planted kudzu here in the county as part of your soil conservation program.
Well, since you said that, I have to agree with you. Will you finish?
Well, what I was going to ask, I couldn't resist throwing the kudzu in. But once they came in and got their shower and got cleaned up, could they just go to town, or?
They could on the weekend, but not during the week. And of course, on a special occasion where they could get permission to go into town and that kind of stuff. But they mostly played games. We had a recreation room and played shot pool, and we played basketball, baseball, football, all these things. We had a good recreation.
But it wasn't like the Army that you had to have a pass to leave and to come back necessarily?
Well, you did. If you were very strict during the week. Now, on the weekend, you had your weekend off. And you could go in, and the trucks would carry you into town, but you had a certain time you had to get back.
Oh, okay.
I know, and if you missed that truck, you might have to walk 10 or 15, 20 miles to get back to camp, but you better be there when roll call the next morning, because then you get kicked out.
And did they have punishment like KP, just like the Army?
Oh, yeah.
Absolutely.
Most hated job in camp.
Yeah.
Beyond the material benefits the country derived from the CCC was the mental, spiritual, and physical help the lost youth of the Depression received from the Corps. From problems, they became assets to their country and their community.
Hundreds of young men got their GEDs through the CCCs, and they learned skills that was marketable. And of course, they learned skills, and when the Army called them in, when World War II started, and it started the draft act September 16th, 1940, many of those young men were called in at that time that they were inducted and went into the Army, and they could use those skills too. They come in handy. They easily made rank quick. A lot of the men had been in the CCC.
I've read the same thing, that to a large degree the CCC boys were the cadre of World War II, the corporals and sergeants,
Right.
and helped train that 16 million man army that
There was good bit of criticism about that before the actual war started. A lot of people who were anti-CCC said that, you know, that the Army was training, that it was military and wasn't constitutional, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I left Carterville, and I went into the Army with the 4th Coast Artillery and went to Panama. And then I stayed down there till 39 and come back. Got out of the Army, got married, but I was in the regular Army Reserve, and so I got called back for Christmas of 1940. I received an invitation to return to active duty immediately.
Now, you're one of those young men that the Cartersville boys didn't like because you were from North Carolina and met a Cartersville girl.
That's right.
And here you are today, huh?
Yeah.
Well, listen, let's go out to Clear Lake and take a little footage of where the camp was back in those days.
Sounds good.
First time I was on this hill was day after Labor Day in 1935.
Well, my first day here was on a Saturday, June the 25th, 1935.
Now, Woodrow, I understand this is where you and Joe first met each other, was right here.
That's right, in 1935. I arrived here on June the 25th, 1935, and we began setting up this camp, and this is where I met Joe Myers.
Now, we're on Highway 41, and this, if you rode by here today, you'd never know that there was such a facility on this spot. Could you tell us what was in the background here where these houses are today?
It was all woods, and we moved in here and began clearing out and cutting down little trees and brush and setting up tents. And then the following week, we began to get in the portable barracks and began bolting them together. And by September, we got here in June. By September, we had the camp completed and began to get in the men for the soil conservation camp that was here.
And Clear Lake is just right over the hill from these houses, is that correct?
It is, just right over the hill, and that's where we used to go down in the evenings and wash off down in Clear Lake until we got our showers set up and we hauled all our water from Adairsville.
Okay, well, let's go down to Clear Lake and take a look at that and see what it looks like today. Woodrow, what was here back in those days?
Here at Clear Lake is where we set up, just up above the lake here, and the woods. It was strictly all woods back there, but there was a picnic area down here on the lake. And when we cleared out and set the tents up there until we got our barracks and got our water tank up till we could haul water from Adairsville, we used to come down to the lake, and we'd come down through the woods and we'd take our bath here in the lake. And then down at the picnic area where there used to be a lot of people come down here, and it was a swimming area. And we would
come down here, and this is where we met a lot of people from Cartersville and so forth that would come up here on picnics.
Now, I understand this is where you met your future wife, was right here.
Yeah, my wife belonged to the Tabernacle Baptist Church in Cartersville, and they was having a picnic up on the lake here, and one evening I come down to the lake, and this is where I met my wife. And it was 1935.
That's a great story. Now, when this lake was first built, Joe, I believe you told me that it was kind of a spa for tourists, or...
There was a tourist camp. It was located a little near the highway. Now, whether this lake was built for that purpose or not, I don't know.
But this was a very popular place back in those days, a clear lake here. People come from Cartersville, and they come from Ackworth and all. It was a good swimming area and a good picnic area.
Well, I do know back near the highway where the building is was a kind of a restaurant where you could get a drink or sandwich. I remember had some mighty good pie. Mrs. Ellison, Glenn Ellison, I believe, operated that place. And of course that was one, if maybe not the only place in the county you could do that at that time.
It was a little general store. He had everything, and he had the gas and oil, and there's a filling station, and had a little restaurant and everything. It was combined. It was sort of a general purpose type of business.
And stayed open reasonably late. Didn't close at sundown.
In 1942, a few months after Pearl Harbor, the CCC was abolished so that its young men could participate in the war effort. Ed Martin remembers the end of the CCC camp in Cartersville. Ed, when did you come to Cartersville?
Came here in 1932.
And you have a memory of the CCC camp?
I have a pretty good memory of the camp because I visited up there several times. I sold them a lot of lumber and hardware and merchandise while they were here, and I had the opportunity to.
Well, tell me about the caliber of people the CCC boys were.
Well, they were great. They were the finest bunch of boys that I'd ever been around, and they were all come from nice homes, I think, and I never heard of one ever been drunk, or never heard of them giving the police department any trouble. They were just fine boys.
Now, I understand they came from all over Georgia and elsewhere, but some of them elected to stay here in Bartow
Some of them are here right now, several of them, a lot of them. They married local girls, and they were made good citizens too, great boys.
Now, once the CCC camp closed down when World War II came, what happened to the facilities and the property up there?
Well, we was preparing ourselves for an American Legion home here, and a fellow by the name of Mr. George Woodrow Sr. was caretaker of that property up there. There was approximately 40 acres of property up there. And he advised some of the old World War II men that he could get that property for us for a good, cheap. So we investigated it. They did, and they bought 40 acres of land up there for approximately $4,000, around $4,000. That's my memory. And we started to work on it with the help. The World War I veterans was. We let them be in leadership of it. Some of them had already belonged to the Legion. They joined the Legion before they even got back home over in France after the war. And they were great help to us. And we went to work and we see what we come up with up there.
Oh yeah, that's a nice facility.
Nice place, wonderful place.
Now you obviously don't have 40 acres up there now. What happened to the land?
We sold some of it, and we gave away a lot of it. I think we give the city enough land to extend Dixie Avenue on up to the old street, Moon Street, they were at that time. And we gave some land to I think it's that 4-lane highway over there. We gave them that. But we had it. And we sold that part where the shopping center is over there now.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But we still own the rest of it, and we still maintain our fire. And it's not growing now and we're glad of it because we don't want no more wars no how.
That's good.
Yeah.
Well, Ed, thanks so much for sharing those memories with us and kind of clearing up a little mystery as to how the land was acquired and American Legion took it
That's
over
right.
when the CCC left here.
I appreciate you giving me this opportunity.
Thank you.
It's great.
He seemed to know dozens of people, politicians and farmers. Moreover, he knew the countryside with an intimacy that must have been gained by close and repeated investigation. He spent part of nearly every day, sometimes whole days, exploring the back roads, visiting with farmers, simply driving into yards, pulling up under the trees, and hailing whomever he could see. In these casual conversations, he had learned more about farmers' grievances than he would ever have discovered in New York, where they were filtered to him through professionals, or could have learned in Hyde Park on what was not a farm, but an estate. There were no barriers, or anyway, none such as existed wherever else he went. He learned something real about life down the dirt roads and in the farmyards of Georgia, and he learned it for good. The WPA, the Works Progress Administration, first of all raised the morale of millions of Americans at a time when they had reached the lowest ebb of their lives. In place of direct city or state relief, there was honest work and a paycheck. Monthly wages averaged between $40 and $50, and the work week was 40 hours. From the summer of 1935 to its end in 1942, the WPA spent $10 billion and employed almost 8 million men and women, who in turn supported family groups numbering 30 million Americans. In the beginning, the WPA took over unfinished state or civic projects, which had been shelved by the Depression. Today, thousands of libraries, schools, hospitals, bridges, 600,000 miles of public roads, courthouses, and other public structures stand as lasting memorials to the WPA and its workers. Besides public works, the WPA also taught women how to sew, how to weave baskets, teach school, catalog local and national historical documents for future scholars, take care of nursery-age children, and conduct naturalization classes to instruct immigrants in the fundamentals of Americanism. It was more than a pick and shovel operation. It had a federal music project which employed more than 10,000 musicians. It included a federal theater project with an annual budget of $7 million, employed more than 12,000 actors, actresses, and entertainers across the nation. Writers such as John Steinbeck received his start with the WPA. There were also famous actors such as Henry Fonda, who received his start in life as an actor through the Federal Theater Project. A small circus group might enthrall a crowd of children in Central Park on a Saturday morning, while on a sage-covered hill in the far west, a marionette show was bringing squeals of delight from the combined families of local sheep herders. It was the New Deal at its finest hour. Mr. Tatum, we're here at Dillinger Park, standing in front of this ditch that runs all the way through and past the park. And I understand that when you were a young boy that you used to come over here and watch the WPA work on this ditch. Would you tell us a little about it?
Yes, sir. My daddy would bring us boys, and best I remember, I was in 3rd grade up here at Pine Grove School, where this ditch starts. And we'd watch them, and then we'd come back maybe the next time, and they'd be going through these hills back of this ditch back of me. And they would have, it'd be so deep, they'd have a man down in the bottom. He had him a bench to throw it as high as he could, and
I've checked on that, and there was 2 more, and then the man on top in the deep part, throwing it out by hand, and they dug a deep ditch, and it was hard ground, chert we call it, but you make base, sub-base on roads.
Now, I understand that the reason for that, this whole area would flood with a hard rain.
Yes, and they couldn't even go in T-models or ride a mule or anything when the river from Rome, as before the dam was built, would back up. And down here on where we lived, he'd stay up 2 weeks at a time.
Tell me about Frogtown. I understand that the water would back up. How far would it back up going toward the highway?
All right, it was just a dirt road and this 2-lane road, and all you had was T-models and wagons and buggies. And when I started to Carterville School, I was promoted from this Pine Grove School to the 5th grade from the 4th. And many times I'd ride with our landowner of a morning. He run a liver stable in Carterville and sold mules. Well, of the evening, I had to go home and do chores and help out and get ready and feed the mules and all. And the water had risen there where WBHF is today. I'd have to walk up by the Backus house and where Ellick Dent on the ridge to get back in Rockmart Road, and all of this area between this ditch here, north of me here, and it would be spread out, and we would duck hunt all in there where those houses are built now in an old bathtub.
That's interesting. How many people would be working on this ditch with the WPA at one time?
They'd be 75 to 100, and they kept adding on all the time because people was dying for something to work, Mr. JB's work, to make some money. Because a 50-cent piece in your pocket felt like a wagon wheel. We didn't have money, but we had plenty to eat.
How much were these men paid for? Then these are grown men, right?
Yes, sir.
Family men and...
Well, I heard my wife say that her daddy in Pickens County started off at 75, but he didn't cents a day. But it wasn't long. Most all of them made $1, and before it played out, I think they got a little higher, maybe $1.25 a day. And that's about what they paid on the section lines for this little seaboard railroad over here by Lads.
It's also my understanding that the WPA did other things besides this 3-mile ditch. According to your memory and what you recall or hear that other people have told you, what other projects did they do here in the county?
Well, Mr. Arthur Neal was commissioner when I was a little boy, and he stayed in for years, about 27 years, and he'd get these the money from the government, and they would let him use them on the roads, and if they built any buildings or anything, they would furnish the hand labor. And even the roads leading out of Carterville, whether it was, most all of them was just wagon and buggy and later T-models, and they would use them on the roads, doing road work, hauling gravel in the dry time in the fall of the year out of the creek beds when it was low, on 2-horse wagons, and put the gravel after they'd worked on them and shaped them up.
How about specific buildings that they worked on that you might recall?
The jailhouse that's on to the old house over there where the sheriff lived back in those days, and then they built a brick one. And I know they used the men to make mortar and with the timbers and so on, and also the county home this side of White's. That was built for the old age people. And the county owned that ground at that time, about 30 or 40 acres in there.
Now, was that called a pauper house, or?
Well, way back they called it pauper. And the old one was over here like you going from Lads down here off of Rockmart Road to Dallas, and they called it Small Pox Spring. And that's back in days before you got your vaccination, and they would let the old people live over there and the people with smallpox. And they, on account of the big spring there, and they named it later. So many people had smallpox and died, and they let old people live in them little buildings, wood buildings, and then when he got this money from the government, he built that nice brick home up there for the old people.
That's at Rydell at 411.
Yeah, on 411, right going to Fairmount.
Okay. Now, I noticed up at Cassville, we were doing some filming up there recently, and there's a monument right in the square where the old courthouse used to be before and during the Civil War.
Yeah.
And it's a monument to commemorate the city that was never rebuilt, and it's stamped WPA. So apparently they worked on all types of projects here in the county.
They did. They helped out cemeteries, and they just used them anywhere that they needed hand labor. And another thing, Mr. JB, I thought about, right away, they didn't have these mowers and big heavy equipment and mow trees big as your leg, and you had to do it by axe and bush axes later. That's modern, a bush axe, and keep the right-of-way cut from growing over the little roads. They was all narrow, and when the men is too wet to work on the road, they would cut right-of-way.
Okay. Did they build any bridges here in the county that you're familiar with?
Yes, they built several little small bridges, and they'd usually get a steel erector to come out of Atlanta or somewhere and build. And at one time we had about 11 of these truss big steel bridges, and they was all floored with lumber, and we had to put them close together on account of the mules were scared of the crack, and they would use 3-inch lumber, and most of them was 12 foot wide. And then later, the bigger bridges over Etowah River, they would make them 16 foot wide, and it'd take 16 foot lumber. And back in those days, lumber was cheap, and they'd use 3 by, well, the wider they could get, faster they could floor them. And they'd be hardly ever you'd find a 3 by 8. Most of them 3 by 10s, 3 by 12s, 3 by 14s, because they had big lumber, and then you'd put your 2-inch runners for the mules to walk on in the wagon, and they wouldn't put nothing right in the middle, and they wouldn't be afraid to go across it with a solid, and it would last up in the air for years.
Mr. Tatum, there's a lot of people that are not really familiar with the WPA, and I'd like for you to tell us the time period. How long ago was this that all of these projects were built here in Bartow County?
Well, I'd say in a year or two after Roosevelt come in, and he beat Hoover in 32. And I'd say in the early 30s, they worked in this county with different projects, like I've told you before. And then later, they worked with CCCs when they began to terrace ground and make bridges and things, even for farms, and where they couldn't get across creeks and things, and they'd build oval-shaped bridge out where I live. I could show you one, and they're still working the drainage where it ran together, 2 roads met, and they done permanent work, and they'd use rock, and they'd pour a slab over an arch bridge because it'd be stouter. And those things, still some of them in this county.
That's right. Well, listen, we certainly appreciate you sharing your time with us today. And
all right, sir, Mr. Tate. I enjoy it, and I can remember it just like it was yesterday.
Very good. Thank you.
Over half a century has passed since the end of the Great Depression, but for millions of elderly Americans, their experiences of that time have cast a long shadow over the rest of their lives. Many of them became human squirrels as relentless savers to be ready for the next time. Others never trusted banks and hid their money. Most of these veterans of hard times never forgot how to survive by their wits and were very resourceful the rest of their lives. One of the positive effects of the Depression was to bring families closer together, since it requires the efforts of all to survive. For most Americans who have been born since Pearl Harbor and have never experienced a depression, they can still find inspiration and perhaps a sense of awe as they listen to their stories. There is an old adage that there is no growth without pain, and certainly that generation of Americans had a rendezvous with destiny.
Nobody likes being hot, nobody likes being cold, and nobody likes spending a lot